And welcome to the meeting of the FFT committee. It's nice to see everybody after a short period of time since our last board meeting in Augusta. We've got an interesting agenda this morning. Hopefully, this will be a real period of discussion and not just presentation. I know that Ryan's got a number of items to present to us, but this is going to be a real opportunity for the committee to ask questions and discuss various things. So hopefully this will be a very active meeting today. First of all, Beth, could you please call the roll?
Yes, good morning. Trustee Cates?
Here.
Trustee Flood?
Here.
Trustee Riley?
Here.
Trustee Mishu?
Here.
Trustee McMahon?
Here.
Trustee Kane?
I know she's here.
A minute ago.
Yep.
Can you hear me? I said I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes. And I don't
Okay,
think
great.
that Trustee Eames is here.
Okay, and we have, I think, a couple of non-committee members, board members joining us this morning as well. I see Valerie Landry here, and is Donna Loring here? Let's see Donna yet, and Barbara Alexander's here. So, welcome. So
I'm here too, Roger. Owen McCarthy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Owen, didn't see you. Oh, you're right up at the top too. Okay. So good morning, everybody. We're going to start off with a discussion of the system in the shared services budget and also any budget changes since our last time. As you recall, Ryan told us that as is consistent every year, from the time the budget's presented to now, there are inevitable minor changes and tweaks to one or more campus budgets. He's going to tell us about that. And then we'll go on to talk about the system and the shared services budgets, which we have not yet discussed. So with that, let's turn it over to Vice Chancellor Lowe to begin that discussion. Ryan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm super excited to be here today. As you noted, a number of different topics. I've got a lot of paper here across my desk. So would just back up your point that I'm light on presentations today. I have information. I'm open to have a dialogue with the committee based on the questions that you had, and I don't want to share my screen for 2 hours. And so I'm going to try to talk through these topics. I would encourage you to interrupt me along the way with clarifying questions or comments as we go. So again, as the chair said, I'll start off with the UMS shared service governance budget and any budget changes, and I'll do the budget changes first. As the chair said, again, we often have changes in between March and the April meeting, or in between March and even the May meeting. We actually only had one change this year. It was entirely budget neutral, so that's really a reflection of the hard work the campuses did on the front end, the fact that we didn't have to make a bunch of changes. In this case, there was one change. It was at the University of Maine. The campus or the university changed the way that they charge for out-of-state graduate assistants. And so that one of the, I see Kelly and Joan and others here, so they can correct me if I start to go astray. But one of the challenges there is, like all of this, you forecast in advance what you think you're going to get for students and what the mix of those graduate students might be. And in some cases, they're in-state and some out-of-state. And if you budget wrong, it doesn't have a budget impact because we show the tuition coming in and then we waive it down at the bottom, but it creates accounting challenges. So I thought I was going to have 3 in-state students, and instead I had 2 out-of-state students, and now I need to go in and do a budget entry and make everything balance back out again, and so on. So that's really just a long way of saying that the campus is proposing to make a shift there and to treat all of their out-of-state graduate students to charge them the in-state rate, which is $5.57 a credit hour. That has no impact on the system or the university's bottom line. It simply adjusts the amount between tuition and financial aid between those two lines. So again, they net out, no impact to the campus. I'm happy to answer any questions on that one. But again, no budget impact.
Ryan, if I could just emphasize,
Please.
it's not all out-of-state graduate students. It's just those that have the assistantships.
Yeah, thank you.
Any questions for Ryan about that? Okay, I forgot, I didn't see him, but Clyde Mitchell is here. Clyde, you there on the screen somewhere. Clyde is our faculty rep. Certainly want to welcome Clyde, as well as obviously all of our campus presidents who are with us this morning. Good morning. And senior representatives from the system as well. Glad you're all here. So if there are
If
if there are
you
no questions, why don't you go ahead with governance and shared services?
Okay, so this will be the one presentation you get from me today. So we talk again a little bit about governance and university services. I'll take a step back, as I always do on this presentation, just remind you a little bit about how we're structured and kind of the three pieces of the system office, if you will. University services, again, typically what you think of as shared services, and I'll get into the detail of that in just a minute. Governance being, again, what we typically refer to as the chancellor's office, even though it's a little bit broader than that. And again, detail coming on that. And then university services unallocated tends to be those kind of one-off strategic investments that the board has made. Sometimes they're on a one-time basis in a budget. Oftentimes, and you'll see this again when we get to the slide, they're multi-year commitments, multi-year strategic investments. So let's talk about each of those three units in just a second. But one of the questions, and I did add this slide in since the March 20th meeting, one of the questions that came up at your March 20th meeting was, how do you charge for shared services? And again, little bit of context. For a number of years, in the early years of shared services, we really just we'd come up with our budget kind of at the system office. We'd take that full amount off the top of the appropriation, and then we wouldn't necessarily charge the campuses. We just in a way we would, because we were taking it off the top of the appropriation, but it wasn't a direct kind of one-to-one chargeback for those services that we were providing. We made that change in the 2012, 13, 14, that kind of early 2010-ish window, where we were looking for more accountability as university services, as we continued to centralize administrative functions, as those charges and that piece of our budget got larger and larger. We and the presidents wanted us to be more accountable for that, and not simply just, increase our share 3% every year and so on. So we moved to a model where we charge campuses for those different types of services. And we centralized a lot of services. You can see a lot of those right here, from IT, legal, human resources, facilities, kind of work your way around the circle. And we, as you might expect, we charge for each one just a little bit different. It depends on what the service is. And so think about something like IT and legal. We're using student and employee FTE counts because, again, that makes sense, because we're providing IT services, if you will, to both employees and students, and so that makes sense to use that as a metric for charging back to individual campuses. Human resources based on employee headcount. Again, the number of employees that HR is interacting with, campus employee headcount is what we use there. Facilities, we use the overall system square footage. So if you might imagine if the University of Maine is 55% of the square footage of the entire system, then for those facilities functions, they'd be charged 55% of that pool, roughly. Student services by FTE, and again, you can see the other categories here: finance by operating expenses, and then procurement by the total procurement goods and services that you purchase. So that answers the question that came up a little bit last week about how we charge for those services.
Questions? Ryan, if I can interrupt you. So
Yeah,
your
please.
screen is showing, so if anybody's trying to raise their hand, we probably can't see it. So during this presentation, I know Ryan will be comfortable. People just speak up if you've got a question or a comment
Yep.
as we go along.
And I've got the little small
I-
faces up on the right side of the screen. So if you use the hand function, I can see you as well.
I did have a question. It's Barb Alexander.
Please go ahead, Barbara. Thank you.
On the student services FTE, is that full-time equivalent?
It is.
Does that, in your opinion, properly handle the large volume of people who come in for a course or two at UMA or other places? And how are the equivalent or the competency-based education student population included in there?
Yeah, I don't know if I have, I don't know, Miriam or if I have others that want to help me. I think as a reminder, this piece is for those system-wide services. So some of those functions are going to be covered, on the campus. So, Ray's shop is going to have something specifically set up for student services. I think this one is related to the shared processing center, but correct me if I'm wrong there, Miriam.
Yes, and I can answer that. It is related to the shared processing center, and there is a small amount for a student support function. So we're talking about in our budget a total of $600,000 that we are allocating out to the campuses using that student FTE. To take it a little bit, just for clarification, we also use some of these same categories when we're using when we're doing the appropriation allocation. And to your question, when it comes to student services at the campuses, we are using a head count rather than an FTE to address the very thing that you are asking about. So that is a good metric to use. In our case, it's really so small and it's not really directly related to servicing a student. It's more some of the administrative functions for some student services.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. So again, I'm going to kind of work my way around the circle in this presentation. Talk a little bit about governance. Again, governance is typically what we think about as the Chancellor's office, although it's broader than that. It includes staff from trustee's office, so it's going to include Beth here, chancellor, senior leadership. So think of vice chancellor's positions like that, senior positions across the system, and then the staff that support those. So it is 26 positions. I know historically we took a look at this last year during the board budget presentation. It has been in the 25 to 26 position range for a number of years. This year, it is technically up one position from last year. There's no budget impact, but one of the kind of the reorganizations we did around, Miriam, was it adult degree completion or early college?
Adult degree completion.
So adult degree completion, we had moved under Vice Chancellor St. John as part of a reorganization effort. And so that person moved over under Jeff's team. Of the money that was supporting that position came with it. So technically the head count went up by one, but the budget impact in this case was neutral. It was actually a decline, which I'll get to in just a minute. A little bit more detail on that. So again, this shows you the governance budget for 2025 for that 26 person staff. Again, you can see up here, it is funded from state appropriation. So it's the first 6.7 million that comes off the, maybe the 239 million or more that comes in from state government. It is flat from last year. You can actually, it's just slightly down about 1.5%. Not a lot of change going on in this budget. You can see that here. There are savings reflected from the benefit rate change, which I'll talk about as at an upcoming agenda item. And then everything else is largely flat with last year's numbers. It gives you about, again, as I noted here, about a $6.7 million budget for FY25, down 1.5% from 2024.
Questions?
So
Ryan,
the
I don't know.
yeah, sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if you can answer this or not. I mean, this is, we've had to make some adjustments and downward adjustments, excuse me, in recent years because of financial challenges. I don't know if you're in a position to answer. Are there any things here where we're really getting, from your perspective, close to the bone, in terms of we really can't cut much more, or boy, I wish we were doing better because we'd like to be spending a little bit more on travel or memberships or whatever. I didn't ask you that before today, so I apologize for throwing it out now.
Yeah, so certainly in this, I mean, it's a different answer depending, I suspect, whether you're on a campus or when you're talking about the shared service budget. I think we feel comfortable that this budget reflects a budget that that we can live with, that we would we love more in certain areas or more professional development, more travel? Great. But I'm not sure it outweighs the benefit that we're providing by keeping our rate flat to the campuses. And so I guess there's no specific need here. I think this budget, both for governance and then the budget I'll show you in just a couple of minutes, does okay with the resources that it has. Maybe when I get to the next piece of this, I'll come back to that question because that's a good one.
Thank you.
So university services, again, this is when you think of shared services, and those of you who have a state government background, remember the service centers that we set up there. This is what that represents. This is the university services allocated budget. It is about a $53 million budget. It recognizes the administrative consolidation that we've had in IT, HR, finance, facilities. You see the list through there. For background, again, we started these back in about a little more than 10 years ago. We started with IT. We moved to HR, procurement, facilities, and then eventually finance and some of the other areas. So we've had a lot of experience doing this for about 12 years now. This is an area that is always challenged to the question that you specifically asked, Mr. Chair. We want to, every year I go into this, I want to do what I can to keep the rates at least flat, if not look for opportunities for reductions. It's a challenge because in a lot of these areas, certainly we're being asked to do more than we were 5 or 10 years ago, and IT is the perfect example of that. When we started the consolidation, we all had we had one device with us. It was either the 75-pound laptop that we dragged around or the big desktop that we had on our computer. And now we all have many different devices. We have lots of software options. We know those software packages typically automatically increase at 5% a year. And so keeping the rates flat has been a challenge. It means that we're not, maybe we're not investing in employees and other areas, software opportunities as much as we could. But again, it's always a balancing act. If we put more in this budget, it means we're charging the campuses more. It means there's less available for them to balance their budget, more cuts potentially on the student side of things. And so I think we can do the job that we've signed up for with the resources that we have this year. So 386 positions system-wide. Again, pretty flat over the last 4 to 5 years. I think, like governance, it is technically up 1 position. IT is the biggest chunk here. Again, more than half of the positions IT, and then the next big chunk, probably a quarter of those in HR and finance and budgeting. Trustee McMahon.
Ryan, how do the headcount and the dollar allocation compare to our peer group? of university systems and universities?
Yeah, so an interesting question. It's not something that we have specifically for data when we use the the peer tool that we have doesn't drill down at the system level, even though we have some system peers. It doesn't drill down into that level. The other thing is that I find this every time I go anywhere, I talk to colleagues, we're on by far the cutting edge of administrative consolidation. I have lots of conversations recently I had at a NECHI meeting I was at where people were asking specific questions about, how did we consolidate finance and budgeting? Hey, we just consolidated IT last year, and here's the problems that we're having. I don't know the specific answer to that because there's not a lot of folks that look like us that are consolidated in as many areas as we are. I will say we do, we try to do, and especially true in, IT, HR facilities does a much better job of this procurement than maybe I do in financing, but we do a really good job. Those areas do a good job of reaching back out to our user groups, our stakeholders, to get feedback on the services that we're providing. Are there places where there's gaps? And so we're always looking for opportunities to improve, but I don't know specifically how that relates to others, but something we'll continue to look at.
We've got Barbara and then Valerie.
This is actually a question for the chair, Roger.
Right.
Has FFT actually had a briefing about this IT budget and the 200 persons working in that area in terms of, getting a handle on what's going on with this huge amount of money and personnel, and had some kind of oversight of that system? As a member, as someone who's not a member, I just didn't want to presume that.
Yeah, well, every meeting, well, almost every meeting, not including today, we get IT is on the agenda. For the last couple of years, it's been David Demers who's been briefing us on that. Open to questions from the committee, and during the actual budget process, well, that's not so because we're doing that today. But yes, it's a regular part of our agenda. I don't think we've drilled down into why 206. Is that the right number? Could we get down to 190, or should we really be at 215? We haven't got to that level of granularity, but it's a regular agenda item for the committee.
The other piece, if I could, Mr. Chair, is
Yes.
that in the I think it's the January meeting, we have the state of IT report, which
Yes.
does go into the weeds of all the specific pieces of IT. So happy to share that with Trustee Alexander or any of the committee as well. And then also happy to take a deep dive into IT anytime the committee is looking for a topic that it wants to explore more.
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, Valerie Landry?
Thanks, Roger. Am I correct in that 386 figure, Ryan? That includes anybody who's on a campus, right? So HR includes the campus people who are in HR, but they're based on in the various universities. You're nodding your head. So
Yep. So the 53 million, it's on the very next slide. I kind of take the university services versus unified services versus campus services. So you're one slide ahead of me. But again, we divide it between those unified services. So things like the controller's office and me and Miriam and the central finance versus campus services, which might be a university CBO is like the best example of them. So it does include both sides of that.
Thanks. Pat Flood.
Thank you and good morning. My question is a pretty simple one. I just wasn't sure, Ryan, if when we hire our new chief human resources officer, is that someone that would fall under the governance group or under the university's the services group? I know that I didn't know which area it fell into, which box it fell into.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to ask Miriam the same question at the beginning of every budget year, and unfortunately, I forgot what she told me. I think it is included in that one, but she's going to correct me if.
That's right. Yeah, the new CHRO, that would be part of governance.
Yeah.
Governance, okay, great, thank you.
Yes. And that position is already included in that head count or position count that you saw previously for governance.
And thank you again, thanks.
Thanks. Mike Michaud.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, a quick question. Putting on your other hat when you was over at, as commissioner, is there any way where we can actually take advantage of what the state's doing with their IT, what the community college doing with their IT? Because I know IT is a big budget, and I don't know if there's any way we can work collaborating together.
Yeah, we do a lot of that. We piggyback a lot. And credit to procurement here. A lot of IT contracts we piggyback on, or we give them the opportunity to piggyback on. I'll talk with the IT team and see if maybe that's something we can work into to an upcoming agenda. There's a lot of places where we work with the community college specifically in that space. The chancellor just highlighted a bunch of those in that report that he did talking about partnerships with the community college. But let me explore that one with our team a little bit more and work with the chair to maybe put that one on an upcoming agenda, and we can talk specifically about that one.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Good question.
Thanks. Owen McCarthy. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Ryan, thank you for this. For the campuses, we sort of measure effectiveness based on enrollment or in their balance in their budget and like these things. Like with the internal services, how does your team think about measuring it, delivering what you want it to deliver? And I know it's a little murkier because you have a lot of internal stakeholders, but would be curious on that.
Yeah, I think on that one, let me address it at a high level, and then I'll follow up with some specific information. Because again, I don't know that I've asked about it in the last 12 months or so, but I know, facilities, risk and procurement, and then even on the IT side, used to do, we've done customer survey pieces. And so we measure different things depending on what it is we're trying to do. So procurement is going to measure something different than maybe an IT help desk call and things like that. So I know those are tools we measure. How long does it take us to answer the phone? Things like that. But let me get a good feel for what those are. Maybe some recent results. And again, the chair and I have talked about what are big topics that we could put on agenda items. And so this might be a good one, a little deeper dive into university and shared services.
Great, thanks, Ryan.
Thanks. I'm not seeing any other questions. If there are any, just speak up.
All right, so let me roll through these last few slides and then we'll open it back up again. So again, as Trustee Landry noted, there are two pieces to university services. We've got what we think of again as those unified services. So the services that we provide where we provide at the system level, and then they support and touch all of the campuses. And then there is the campus service portion of that. And so let me give you, again, I mentioned the CBOs being a perfect example. Going back to when we consolidated, the board consolidated finance across the system, they made all of those employees. And so, all of the CBOs that you see on this call today, the staff that work for them, they are all technically system employees. They're in the group that we refer to as UMS 08. They're in that kind of centralized finance structure, but they exist at the campus level versus myself, Miriam, and others who are at the system level. We do give the campuses flexibility to determine the size of the campus services portion of their budget. And so, those are charges that go directly to the individual campus that is using those services. So at the end of the day, if President Cushman and the finance team, come to us at the system from UMA and say, we really feel like we need one more person in finance that's going to do this very specific function that's a gap that we don't have right now. We give them that flexibility to submit that request, and assuming we think it makes sense, we put it in here because it goes directly against their budget. It's not something that's hitting, the Machias budget or the Fort Kent budget. They're the best person to know whether they need that service, or they'll tell us when they don't as well. We feel like we're maybe overstaffed. We're going to make a reduction here. So this is the allocated services budget for 2025. That shared service line is right here in the middle of the expense one. So again, this is that same 53 million that I mentioned on the previous page, and then we broke down into the 39 and the 14. You can see here, it is up about 200,000 from last year. I made a commitment to keep that flat, so let me tell you why that actually looks like it shows an increase. So unrelated to the actual, us putting together the budget for 25 around shared services. Again, recall our previous discussion that we had around the benefit rate. We had those, or we haven't had yet, that we're going to have, about the benefit rate. There are some pieces of that rate that we're not allowed to include in the federal rate. And so we moved about 600,000 of expenses that previously were part of the benefit rate over into this allocated services budget. And so notwithstanding that change, and that benefit rate change tremendously helps the bottom line. In this one case, it negatively impacted the shared service line. But again, notwithstanding that one move, we would have been down about 400,000 from 24 into 25. Before I shift, again, that's also why you see this big jump in the line above. You see this 18% increase. Well, that's because we moved $600,000 of expenses that used to be in the benefit pool over here, and that's what's driving that large increase. Again, see the bottom line. We're bringing in a balanced shared service budget. Again, largely flat. That one's a slightly different topic. So before I shift over to the unallocated portion, let me see if there's any questions on allocated services.
Questions?
Okay, I'll finish this last slide and then again open it up if there are any questions. So the last piece of this part of the presentation is what we refer to as university services unallocated. And so this you can see up at the top is from a combination of funding sources. It's the I give you the investment report every month. I always talk about how we have a budget of 2.5 million for investment income. That 2.5 million in investment income that we budget is intended to fund the system's share of deferred maintenance for IT. And so you see the 2.5 million here that we budget, and then look down here, you'll see capital investment at the very bottom. That is 2.5 million. So that is the cost that we're looking to continue to make in IT, network infrastructure, that type of thing that we need to make on a regular basis. We can't just make an investment in 2020 and then sit back and hope it's still hope everything's still good and providing the same level of service 10 years later. So this is what that line represents. The rest of these come from state appropriation or strategic investments where we use dollars that come in through state appropriation and reprogram those. 3.6 million comes in through adult degree completion, early college, interpersonal violence prevention is this one. These are ones where the legislature has said, we've gone in and we've made an argument. Legislature, give us, 1.5 million a year to support adult degree completion efforts across the system. Give us 1.5 million to support early college initiatives across the system. And so in some cases, we've received targeted appropriations, and we need to spend those on targeted programs. And so again, 1.5 million that comes in from adult degree completion, 1.65 million for early college, 400,000 for early college. UMS, here's $75,000. Go do a study on medical school research. Those are all part of this investment, this unallocated pool. There's obviously not a lot of flexibility with them. The legislature gave us $75,000 to study a medical school. We can't turn around and take that 75 and study something completely different. So those ones are somewhat targeted. The rest of these, if I start at UMS system-wide marketing and work my way down the list, they are a product of multiple years of trustee and system investments. And so they're mostly ongoing. Some were made, a couple were recommending this year, some were made last year, some were made by trustees and chancellors 7, 8, 9 years ago, and we still think it's a worthy investment. The funding source from this, you'll see this 10.4 million in strategic fund. That is kind of really break that down into two further buckets. And so one of those buckets would be these administrative initiatives, these administrative consolidations that the trustees have asked us to do going back to 2012. Each of those saved some amount of money. So again, for those of you that were in state government when we implemented service centers, you remember we came to you and said, hey, if we combine all of these back office operations, we're going to save $5 million or $2 million or whatever the number would be. And we then would use that money to help balance the budget. Well, similarly, the trustees, 12 years ago, made the decision that initially that we're going to consolidate IT. We think it's going to save $2 million just to make up a number. And instead of using that to balance the budget, the trustees said, we're going to set that aside and we're going to make critical investments that we think the system needs to make on an annual basis. And then the next year we consolidated HR, and then all of a sudden the savings went from 2 million to say 2.5. And we just kept doing that all the way through finance. And so the trustees built up this source of funding to make these type of annual investments. The other source comes from off the top of the state appropriation. So again, different from governance and so on. And so let's say we get to the point where the legislature decides we're going to give you a 4.5% increase this year, and that equals $12 million. Again, just to make up a number. The trustees decided back in 2017 that whenever we got new appropriation from the state, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the funding model tab coming up in a little bit. But the trustees said, whenever we get new appropriation, we're going to take 30% off the top of that. So we get 10 million, we're going to take 3 million off the top, and we're going to use that to make critical system-wide investments that we know as trustees, we know we need to make, but we don't have a funding source for it. So if everything's going out to the campuses, you can either force the campuses to spend money at the system level, you can take it off the top, or you can do something like this. And so that was the decision the trustees made. So every time we get new appropriation, and it's been about 4 times since we've had this new model in place, 30% comes off the top. Put a little caveat. 1 year we made the decision to lower that so that more money went out to the campuses. We had some campuses that were having some budget challenges, but generally it's 30%. And then generally, again, it goes to these initiatives that otherwise wouldn't be funded at the system level. And so I'll talk about a couple of them and then I'll stop talking. The demolition fund right in the middle of the page, 850,000. That just reflected, again, a number of years we were having conversations with the trustees about excess space system wide. And I would consistently come to you and say, yeah, we want to get rid of property. But if I'm the University of Southern Maine, for instance, and I've got 5 million in reserves, and that's the only flexibility I have in my budget, I'd never recommend using that 5 million to tear down a building that's going to save you $100,000 a year in operating costs. Do we want to get rid of that building? Do we want to get rid of the law school or Dickie Woods or name your building? Absolutely. But we don't want to drain down the savings account to do it. And so we started setting aside a little less than $1 million. It was 1.6 at one point, and it eventually got cut. But setting aside a little less than $1 million every year that we could dedicate to system-wide demolition. We've had conversations about, do we take that $850,000 and maybe leverage it into a revenue bond? And so, maybe it's a 10-year revenue bond. We get 8.5 million, and we can do this one big splash of taking down a bunch of spaces. So that's one source of this. Research Reinvestment Fund is another one. Trustees made the decision probably 6-7 years ago that we were going to establish the Research Reinvestment Fund as a way of kind of encouraging these partnerships in research between the University of Maine and some of our smaller campuses. So President Farini Mundy and her team take the lead on that. The institutional research one, the $500,000, that one and the marketing one were just added within the last several years at the system level. Marketing was 2 years ago, institutional research and system-wide research support more recent than that. So why don't I stop there? I'm happy to answer any questions, but this gives you a general idea of what this kind of pool of investments is meant to cover. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ryan. Questions? I think it's fair to say that as a committee, we have not really taken a deep dive on many of these. And I'd really welcome today or after today from the committee particular lines here that you would like to learn more about beyond just questions today. And feel free to ask questions today. But for instance, capital planning, the amount we're dedicating there, we do go over the capital budget. We might want to look at that number. We might want to look at system-wide marketing and understand what's going on there, the system-wide research support. So I think there's food for some deeper dives as we go forward in the coming months on those. But questions for today, Barbara Alexander.
Following up on your comment, Chair Roger, it seems to me this is a board-wide dialogue that ought to be happening with regard to the use of $10 million in strategic investments and funding. And I would certainly recommend that the board itself use this as a way to talk about whether we're properly focused on our long-term strategic visioning and planning for sustainability of the whole system, and where these dollars might best be allocated. It's to be blunt, it's not just an FFT issue. I hope you agree with that. So I'm learning about the existence of this potential future dialogue. I find it very, very interesting, to say the least. Yes.
Points well taken.
Mr. Chair, do you want me to go through even at a 2-3 sentence level each of these, or do you want to save that? Are there any particular points where folks are really going to drill down? I should have mentioned this the first time. I did want to mention the two. Miriam's going to help me if I go wrong, but at least two of these are new. But some of these are decisions that trustees made a number of years ago. They're tied to people, and so untangling them just comes with the same challenge that untangling people always does. But the two newer ones in here, and again, some have been around for a while. The two new ones are the main center went from 400,000 to 2 million. So 1.6 million there difference. That is specifically, again, associated with the main center and 7 Custom House and 300 4th Street. We've been working through this process, as the trustees know, with the Alfond Foundation. We have agreements to buy those 2 spaces with funds provided by the Alfonds. And so part of kind of this conversion from 300 4th Street being this kind of one-off that the law school kind of had to figure out as we were transitioning out of the old building and into the new one. We want to transition to a spot where those are system resources. And so the proposal that you see in the main center line really moves the facility costs related with those two buildings to the system budget. With all due respect to the law school and the law school budget and all of the great work, and I mean that, all of the great work that they have done getting their budget in line over the last couple of years, whether we make investments in the main center, in that structure, things like HVAC and things, I mean, those should be decisions that we talk about at the system level and should not be up to the individual ups and downs, for instance, of the law school budget. So having the law school, try to also focus on, the life cycle of HVAC units and stuff doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we knew this was one early on that we wanted to eventually move to the system budget. And so that is the proposal. That is the proposal there. That is the only new one there. The other one is the library software investments, and I think I can't see all the faces. Jeff St. John was on here earlier. That is an initiative that Jeff and the Chancellor have been working on, really try to leverage some of the great work that libraries are doing across the system. A lot of times, collaboration costs more. It doesn't always save money. So when you think about it from a library perspective, I want to take this service that the University of Maine is paying for, and I want to expand it. Costs always go up, and that's just the nature of that particular service. And so it often stifles some of the collaboration that campuses or libraries or others are looking to do. And we think with that modest investment, we can really move the needle on some of those collaborations. It's consistent with some of the partnerships that the strategic plan talks about. So that one is a new one. And again, if you want additional information, I think Vice Chancellor St. John could cover that.
Thanks, Ryan. David McMahon.
Ryan, probably a difficult question, but some of these strikes me we could measure a return on investment. Have we ever done that? So, for example, $750,000 on marketing. What's the return on that investment in terms of increased students or retention or whatever it would be? So is there any attempt to measure ROI on those strategic investments?
Yeah, I don't know that we've done that as well as we should. The marketing one was one that we just put in place last year, which is really this budget. So I'll make a note of that so that we're prepared for that piece next year. The other ones, could certainly talk with Joan a little bit about a couple of the research ones in here. You can see we've got about $3 million in research between institutional research and system-wide research. They're two separate buckets, though, so I do want to just clarify that. I mentioned the Research Reinvestment Fund that we run through the University of Maine. We have institutional research. So again, that's the system IR team. So a number of years ago, we did not have that at the system level. Trustees were particularly frustrated by that. We wanted to expand it, and so made the decision at that time that we would support the institutional research at the system level through a portion of this dedicated appropriation. And then down near the bottom, about 4 lines from the bottom, is system-wide research support. Again, Vice Chancellor Farini-Mundy could probably talk about this a little bit more, but her campus has really stepped up in helping some of our other campuses with some of the back office portions of research that you don't think about as much. It was great. They did that for a number of years on their own dime. But again, as they look to expand their own portfolio, it made sense rather than creating something brand new at the system. Hey, let's create a system-wide research support network. It was easier to partner with the flagship in this case, give them some additional resources. Then they could leverage the network they have to provide support for provide support for research at the individual campuses in a manner that was much more cost efficient. So if you'd like more additional information on that one, I'm sure Joan could take that.
Ryan, excuse me, I think that's interesting. So that's the back office. There's also the Al Fund money that's doing system-wide research. So I assume we could say this is the backbone, the enabling sort of infrastructure that allows that to happen.
I think that and a lot of the other research pieces that are going on, but I don't want to talk for Joan, so I'm hoping I'm going to see her face pop.
Yeah,
I
could chime in briefly if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you. So just very briefly on the research reinvestment funds, that has been there for a number of years, and we can get some direct data, Trustee McMahon, about ROI there. A lot of that goes towards seed funding for faculty system-wide to enable them to be better positioned to bring in external funds. And we have spent some of that in recent years on a thematic focus around health and well-being in the state of Maine to try to get people engaged and ready. And that's been quite essential in being ready for some of the congressionally directed spending funding. So we can put that together if it's of interest. Institutional research, UMaine has a very strong IR team of its own, and we partner well, I believe, with the system group and intersect a lot to be sure that we're just amplifying as much capacity as we can there. So it's great to have that. And then on the system-wide research support, Ryan described it perfectly. The other point to note is that daily with the federal government, compliance expectations change, reporting expectations change, all kinds of terms and conditions and grants become more stringent, and we have been able to invest with this support in just a bit more capacity at UMaine to be sure we're keeping up with all of that ruling, those regulations and guidance documents through our Office of Research Administration and others, and then make that available to the rest of the system rather than trying to build that up every place. There is some capacity, of course, in some of our universities, but we want to be sure we're there, and that gets increasingly complex with the CDS because those are with agencies that we have not always had a lot of experience with. Very grateful for them, but it also is important to be sure we're up to speed. So all of this is meant to be system-wide.
Thanks. Thank you, President. Pat Flood.
Thank you. I had three questions. They're all related and they're short questions, I think. My recollection was that these are 15 categories of unallocated projects. They've all come from board decisions. At one point, the trustees approved each of these, some recent and some several years ago, as I recall. And I guess my question is, do they stay on this list until amended or changed or deleted? Once they're on the list, do they stay until we take some affirmative action? That's my first question.
Yeah, unless that action is this is going to be one time or this is going to be 3 times or something like that. But a lot of these have people tied to them. So every year we go through the process and say, yes, are we going to do this again? But typically with people attached, that comes with a different conversation as well.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. And then I only had 2 questions, I guess. My second one was, if there was going to be a change made to any of these 15 categories, it sounds like you have that discussion. If the board was going to involve themselves in something like this, when is the right time? When is the time for the board to look at these topics?
Yep. So always ripe for discussion. Given that the board hasn't gone into, or FFT hasn't gone into a ton of conversations about these, I would think that it would be probably working with the chair to schedule some kind of maybe education session for each of these items, over the fall. And then I would say early in the budget process. So, I don't know if it's a November, January FFT meeting, we start having those conversations. Because again, to the extent it's tied with a person, you wouldn't want to tell me in May that you want to get rid of something that has a person tied to it on July 1st, for instance. And so it's just the normal planning that we would do for any of these. I'd say it's in the January timeframe with an education phase before that, but that's just off the top of my head.
Thanks, Ryan. And Roger, if I could ask one more. If you say tied with a person, Ryan, I'm not quite sure I understand. Does that mean it was proposed by a certain person and it stays because it was tied to that person's objectives?
More like,
or is it tied to a staffing?
the second one. So to use the example that Joan and I were just talking about, system-wide research support. So we literally give President Farini Mundy $875,000 to pay for specific staff that they brought on to provide those services. And so that's different, for instance, than demolition. If you told me today, hey, we don't support demolition, we've changed our mind, I could get rid of that tomorrow. I'd argue why we shouldn't, but I could get rid of it tomorrow. The people side of it's just a different conversation with a different timeline.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pat. Valerie?
Thank you, Roger. And this may be for a future discussion, but number one, I'm assuming, Ryan, that even if the board 5 years ago or 7 years ago or longer made a recommendation, if you all thought that the time had passed for this item to be in this unallocated, you would make that recommendation. So I'm assuming that. And then number two, this recommendation for the new item here, for example, Main Center, is it our assumption then that this would be in this unallocated budget year after year? Does this also include people, or is this just infrastructure on that one?
Yeah, on that one in particular, there are not people associated with the 1.6, but they are ongoing facility costs. And so we would expect them, at least our recommendation would be, it would continue ongoing at a flat number. It wouldn't increase.
And do we have any other centers or places that are not associated with campuses, I guess, that are part of this sort of system budget?
I think that's the one right there, the Main Center. Of course, we're going to be doing a report for you on centers and offsite locations in just a couple of months. But as far as the system goes, that is the one.
Okay, thank you.
Chancellor, good morning.
There we go. Good morning. I want to point out, when it comes to the buildings or the building in downtown Portland, we are obligated to rent them for a period of time and then to execute the purchase. In reality, the rent for the 5-year periods of time is a way to have income without it appearing as a capital gain for the seller. And it was the basis on which we were able to ultimately purchase these properties, which will happen relatively quickly now in the next 2 years. So I want people to understand that there's a difference between this building and how we're paying for it and what the ultimate cost is versus a building that we would be building, for instance, on any one of our campuses. So I just continue to point that out because it is a rental payment, but it really is part of the purchase operation.
Thanks, Chancellor. And along the same lines, the $2 million figure for the Main Center, we were aware of this as we went through, if you recall, the law school budget, because there are a number of questions about their facility costs in the law school budget. And we learned at that time that some of that was actually going to become a system-wide expense through the Main Center. So that's where most of that $2 million comes from, as I recall anyway. Other questions? I just want to go back to something Pat said. And Pat Flood, thank you very much for raising the issue of timing here, and for Ryan for your answer about how we can build a review of this unallocated budget in throughout the course of the year so that we perhaps are a little better informed by the time we get to the April FFT meeting about these various items. And we will make some notes, and if people have thoughts about that, I will work with Ryan to schedule that throughout the course of the year, so that these expenditures we're addressing in January, February, March, whatever, in advance of today. We are, however, at the middle of April, and it leaves us not much time to do a lot with this now. If people have specific lines of this proposed budget for unallocated that they would like to get further information about, please send them to Ryan, and I'd appreciate if you'd copy me and the rest of the committee for that matter, so we'll know. So if somebody has a question about the demolition number, about how it was determined, or some other question about what does institutional research really mean, please get those in, because we don't have another meeting scheduled of this committee before the May board meeting, at least as I recall. But I think we'll have a lot better process going forward in the coming year because of this discussion. So it's been good.
You do have a May FFT meeting, Mr. Chair.
Oh, we do, but that's to for final.
Yeah, we'll have a small piece on the budget and then a regular agenda.
All right, so we will have time to revisit any of these. So if people have questions about them, please get them in advance of that meeting. Any other thoughts on that process, Ryan?
No, just the one piece I forgot to mention, and it's always, I'll mention it because it's positive. We did leave a TBD down here, 750,000. We consistently have, issues that come up, and so that piece is still reserved in here and unallocated. Thanks.
Other questions? The one thing we haven't talked about yet is the board budget, and I know Ryan's got a slide for that as well, and we can talk about that.
Yep. So let me pop that up. Okay. So the board budget, you can see right here in all of its detail. Again, like governance, like shared services, the board office is down from 25 versus 2024. You can see right here, 388,000 was the FY24 budget. There are some modest savings, again, mostly attributed to the benefit rate reduction coming in at about 384 in 2025. Board office budget, it's pretty straightforward. Most of the expenses are, as you would expect for your meetings anyway, are catering and travel. There's really not much else going on up there. And then we have the two staff positions that you see here. So again, slightly down from 25 into 24, and happy to answer any questions, or if the chair or board chair have any comments, I'm happy to pause for those as well.
Yeah, let me before we get to other questions, call on if I could on the chair, Trish, because I know there's going to be an effort to look at the way we are conducting meetings and other ways we might do so in just as effective way and perhaps save some dollars. So Trish, you want to address that?
Yeah, thank you. Lisa is taking the lead on that, and we've done a draft to sort of think about ways we could make the meetings more engaging, more discussion, make sure we get to the campuses, but maybe not as often, to reduce the expenses to the campuses for these meetings. We've been looking at the Hotel Ursa, which has given us an incredible rate of $149 if we have 3 meetings there a year or 2 meetings there a year. All of that is being developed and will be to the board for digging into, and with the presidents to sort of, and the chancellor to sort of think through more cost-effective, efficient ways to run our own meetings. It's in the works. Lisa has been delayed by a trial, so it's delayed a little bit.
Thanks, Trish. So I think we've concluded our discussion on the shared service budget and budget changes, unless anybody has any further questions, and I'm not seeing any hands. So again, people have thoughts about or further questions about the budget as we've just discussed, please get them in because we've got one more shot at this in May. We're going to move now to just a very brief discussion about the allocation model and where we are at and sort of the future dates for further discussion. Ryan?
Sorry about that. Thank you. As you noted, I'm going to stay at high level. I'm going to resist the urge to get into the weeds of the allocation model. Again, as a reminder for anyone that wants to geek out to that YouTube presentation, we did that at FFT last summer. So you can, all you ever wanted to know about the allocation model and more right there on YouTube. I did want to mention just, again, background. We changed this model for the first time, really in our system's history in 2018 and 2019. Our goal at that time was to really kind of rebalance some of the appropriation. It was very clear that we had at least some campuses that were significantly underfunded, not just in relation to peers, but also in relation to other schools within the system. So I think we all agreed we needed to make a change. As I said, back when we were doing that, everyone thought that they should get more money. That was not a surprise. But we're able to get to consensus, and I'm super proud of that. We got all the presidents and CBOs on board. We got the trustees to support that change unanimously. And I think it did largely what we intended it to do. It's the nice thing as I've gone out and talked about it even this year. It's nice to be able to say that, go back and look at my YouTube presentation in 2017. Here's what we said it was going to do, and it's largely rolled out like we thought it was going to do. The goal of that model, without getting into the weeds, was we were going to get all of our campuses roughly on equitable footing in relation to their peers. Didn't mean everyone would be getting 100% of what their peers were getting, but if we can get everyone at 90% of peer funding or something along those lines, that's what the intent of that model was. And again, as I said, we've largely accomplished that through, I think, maybe 4 or 5 increases in resources we've had since 2019. We've significantly changed that kind of rebalanced out that appropriation, especially for some of our smaller schools. Right now, if you look at the 6 institutions that roll, or 7 institutions, that roll into the model, all of them are now funded at roughly 90%. Or slightly higher in a couple of examples in relation to their peers. When we started that, we had campuses that were funded at 70, and we had a campus that was funded at 102% of its peers. And so we feel like, again, it has done what we thought it would do. 2 campuses way overfunded in relation to peers. That was Fort Kent and Presque Isle, and again, that's really a reflection of just changing enrollment patterns there. Even the increases at your pace, they don't flow through the model. So if you look at just the standard students, we've seen a decline there. So their percentage has shot up. But everyone else, UMaine, Augusta, Farmington, Fort Kent, and Maine Law are all almost exactly funded at roughly 90% of peers. So that worked out, like we said, so we're happy about that. We do think, though, we've arrived at the point now where we're ready to transition. We've done that rebalancing, and now the question is, where do we go from here? And so what's next in the life of the allocation model? I think there are a couple of different directions that we could go in. You could imagine going back to a version of what we had pre-2018, 2019, which is we've got this steady state where, you just give me a plus or minus a percentage or two, but we've got this state now where after we've made 4 or 5 years of adjustment where, UMaine is getting roughly 48% of the appropriation and USM is getting roughly 25 and so on all the way down the list. That could be the new steady state. So we get state appropriation next year in 26 and UMaine gets 48 and USM gets 25, and that's the path that we go down. The other alternative might be a version of that, but do we continue to still take some percentage off the top to fund these strategic wide initiatives? If we just keep the amount we have, we could continue doing the stuff we're doing. We just couldn't do anything going forward. We could reprogram the dollars that we're doing now, but we just couldn't do anything new. Or do we continue taking some portion off the top to fund these initiatives that benefit all of the campuses, but where it's not obvious, necessarily who the one is that should be paying for it? So that's kind of the road where we're at. CBOs and I've had several conversations about this. What we have suggested for a plan is that as soon as we get through this budget, hopefully a month and 3 or 4 days from now, then we'll start focusing all of our summer meetings on this initiative. That in the short term, what we would focus on is putting together a plan or a charter for the work that we would do. We did that the first time around, and it was super helpful. And we identified on the front end who our stakeholders were, who we wanted to get input from, what we were looking for an outcome, and got a lot of feedback on the process from presidents, from trustees, from the campus community. And then when we rolled into the actual recommendations, folks felt like they had an opportunity to participate and so on. So we'd like to come back to FFT and the full committee, probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks, with a plan for next steps in the allocation model, and then ultimately come a recommendation back to the board in plenty of time that we could act on it before we needed to finalize FY26 allocations. So that's what we're thinking. Happy to take any questions about the allocation model or the future of that.
So thanks, Ryan. So we'll be coming back to this, but if people have any specific questions right now, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll be revisiting this shortly. But yes, Barbara.
Allocation in this system is exactly like rate design in the utility world. The pie is fixed. There's no free lunch. You're going to divide up what you need to collect from the denominator of the system as a whole. And I'm wondering, again, can you explain why we would go through this painful process of deciding who's going to pay more and who's going to pay less? Because that's the only result that could possibly happen with regard to this process. And I'm just
we need
the underlying cause for starting this process again, please. Thank you.
So we identified that we needed to have this rebalance in place, and so we've done that. We had some glaring examples, and happy to talk about any of them of challenges we had in the old allocation formula, which wasn't a formula. It was just, UMaine, you came into the system and you got 50% of the appropriation, and so you're going to get 50%. So that's what we did for 50 years. So we recognized we needed to do this rebalance. We've done that. Now it's what's next. And so to your point, if that's how you think about it, that this is going to be really complex. And again, that's why the model stayed static for 50 years, is because people got into that. You can't have 7 people think that their pie should get bigger. It just doesn't work that way. As you eloquently said, the pie is only so big. So if your thought is that this is not worth, the internal fights and so on, then that is an argument probably for this steady state. This is what all the campuses are getting right now. And we're just going to keep doing that. One of the reasons why we were successful, I think maybe the only reason we were successful in making this recent change versus the many, many failed attempts after that, was because we identified the failures of all of the previous attempts were exactly to the point that you made about when the pie is not getting bigger, you will never get consensus. We chose to focus on the unique thing about our model is that it only reallocates new appropriations in a different way. There's still this historical appropriation that's consistent with the 200 million you got in the budget. But our focus was only on new state appropriations, because whenever we tried to reallocate something that somebody had been getting for 50 years, that shuts down the conversation in about 2 seconds. And so I think you framed it up right. It's just a question of what do we do next? The current model that we have now is not what we want on a going forward basis. It's just a question of what is.
And the other important policy decision for us to make is that current 30%, is that the right number? For system purposes, maybe it should be 25, maybe it should be 35. So that'll be a interesting discussion too.
Great.
Any other questions before we move ahead? We're a little bit behind, but we can certainly take some time. But Owen.
Sorry for making us more behind.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Ryan, as it relates to the process, it seems like you're going to come with a plan, which sounds great. It early in that plan is to define that goal. Is that how I heard that right? Because I think that's almost the most important. I mean, the most important part is what we're trying to solve for. And I think that's the one I'm the most keen to dig in on, I think, because then from there, really smart people can solve for it for sure.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's how I went back just in the last couple of days and looked at that charter that we did in 2017. And that's how we laid it out. We did a strengths weakness analysis. This is what we hope the final outcome will be. Really, really focused heavily on process and making sure that we had built into that process an opportunity for people to be heard. I've mentioned a few times, I think in the 2 years that we were doing that, I think we figured out I racked up about 7,000 miles just going from campus to campus. Sometimes, I remember driving to Presque Isle, I did, a 20-minute conversation in a class, and then I drove back. One of the best meetings I did, because then for the rest of the process, I could say, if you need me to come somewhere, I'll do it in a moment's notice. Look what I just did, in Presque Isle and so on. So, part of it is convincing people, people come into this thinking that you're not going to, that you're just giving lip service to the fact that you want input. This is one where it's really important that you get input. Everyone is impacted by, appropriation. It's 43% of the pie.
And then agreed, Ryan. I appreciate that sentiment. It makes a lot of sense. And then related to timing, is it a similar one where you try to get all key assumptions like this by November range, like locked in, so you can start to work with the campuses to build the budgets, et cetera? Is that what it means?
We want to work backwards from the trustees saying this is the greatest thing ever, all the way up to that point where you're talking about and so on. Because we can't, by the time November and December rolls around, I need to be able to tell, the presidents, here's what your allocation is. I can't wait until February and then say, here's the other half of your budget. So we want to have a good process, but we also want to have a time built in for people to react.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
just following up on Owen's questions, the time frame for when your recommendations might come to this committee would be roughly when? Do you have a month in mind?
I don't yet. I've got a month in mind. End of next month, hopefully. Sometime I'd like to get you that charter after I get a chance to have some more conversations with the chancellor, with the presidents. So no later than the July meeting. I'd like to get that into you. I think it's a June meeting for FFT. Like to get that into your hands for a reaction, and then again we can amend it based on reaction.
Sounds good. Barbara.
Thank you. My interest in looking at this project is to relate it to some decisions about strategic long-term planning to achieve sustainability and allocating resources to achieve an agenda that is known in advance to allow us to identify the criteria that would suggest changes that would reward and provide resources to carry out a plan of sustainability among the campuses is what I'm going to be looking for and asking questions about. I'm not particularly going to be enamored of a plan that has some formula attached to it that relates to some what do you want to call it, that doesn't take those aspects of the decision making into account. So just to be clear.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. All right, seeing no other hands, we'll move on. And Ryan, you referred to geeking out. I think we're now in the geeking out portion of the agenda where you're going to explain the one-time benefit rate reduction to us.
Yeah, and I've told Miriam on this one, she needs to permanently stay off mute on this one because this is me operating without a net. So do want to talk a little bit about the benefit rate and try to avoid the weeds as much as possible. But, want to note, first of all, when it comes to the benefit rate, it's a constant battle for us. And so it is, we have a benefit rate that I'll get into the specifics here. That's, roughly 50% of salary. And so, $50,000 salary, we've got to set aside $75,000 for that. And so we're never going to get our arms fully around this one so that, we're going to find this magic solution and then we can just put the benefit rate on autopilot for the next 15 years. Ever since I've been here, this is a battle to constantly reset the bar. And so, 5 years ago when I was having this conversation with the trustees, you can probably find a YouTube video somewhere, talking about a benefit rate at that time of probably 53 or 54%, which is higher than what it is today. And I was, as part of the 5-year forecast, I was probably showing you how that rate was going to get to 60% and how it was going to crush all of our budgets. And that's the reality. And, we forecast that out 5 years, and then, we have a bunch of smart people who get around the table with our union friends, and we try to find opportunities to dial that back a little bit. And sometimes it's one times, and sometimes we can do it on an ongoing basis by making some substantive change. And so maybe instead of the rate going from 51 to 53, it only goes up to 52. It rarely will ever go backwards. And so this is a unique opportunity. And again, I'll spend a little time going through the detail. One of the challenges that we have lots of challenges, but one of them is we've got a couple of rates. And so we've got, what we refer to as our internal benefit rate. And then we always talk about what our federal rate is as well. And it's important to note they're different. And they're different because there are things that we have in our benefit rate, things like the dependent tuition waiver that we offer to our employees and family members of employees and so on. That's a great benefit and it's super attractive to our employees, but it's not something the federal government is interested in paying for. There are other costs like health coaching, the third-party administrator that we use for workers' comp, actuaries. Again, things that at one point it made sense that we put in the benefit rate so that we share that cost across the system. But again, one where the federal government said, good for you, no thanks. On our end, we're not interested in covering that. So we have existed with these two rates for a while. It creates challenges on the federal side because we are constantly over collecting or under collecting, and everything is always, there's a 2-year lag, and so we're over. We might set a rate and then get to the end of the year and we've done all our work and we realize we over collected, and so then we've got to keep that in mind so that we use that to reduce the rate 2 years from now. And this constant cycle that we don't necessarily have to deal with our own internal benefit rate. We either end up good or we don't, and we've got a health reserve to balance the dips. And so we've had lots of conversations over the years about, wouldn't it be great if we could transition to one rate? It comes up a lot again when people come in from, I'm sure this happened to Kelly. You come in from a new system where maybe your rate was 35%, and you come over here and somebody tells you it's 50 or 55, and or we're doing a grant and you're telling someone it's 50 or 55. People's eyes bulge right out of their head. So we've had conversations about addressing this problem, but there's always a one-time impact. Whenever you look to make changes like this, there's always going to be this one one-time impact, unless you can find something magical that reduces healthcare costs. There'll be this one-time impact, and it's always prevented us from doing that. So that's the world we've lived in for the last decade plus. So along comes, the repaving Main Street project and the Oracle Cloud. And one of the limitations of that system is that it only supports one rate. It doesn't support this multiple rate. We can't have an internal rate and then also separately have a federal rate as well. So we're being forced into solving a problem that we've been looking to solve anyway. And so we got some folks together to figure out how we were going to attack this issue. I think we were hoping that we would go into it with a budget neutral solution. We were able to come up with one that saves a substantial amount of resources for the campuses. But to be clear, I want to be super clear. It's on a one-time basis. The actual benefit costs for our employees are going at the same rate they were going before. Again, we've just kind of reset the bar. Nobody is seeing reduced benefits, all of that. It's magic, if you will, and now I'll talk to you about some of the magic. So again, we have been over and under collecting from the feds for a little while and had built up a balance. Those balances typically flow into our benefit pool reserve. And when we get to the reserve policy, tab 5, I'll talk a little bit more about the reserve buckets, but just know in advance, one of them is the benefit pool. It typically hovers in that $25 to $35 million range historically. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. The recommendation is always that you have 3 to 6 months worth of claims on hand. Our current balance is about 3 months, so we're in pretty good shape there. So what we had recommended, or what was part of this proposal, is we used a portion of those over recoveries. We moved $2.1 million worth of the dependent tuition waiver out of the benefit pool and into the individual campus budgets. And so you'll see those reflected in some of the scholarship lines. We moved about $600,000 of those third-party administrative costs and actuaries and wellness costs over to the shared service budget, pulled those out as well. And so the benefit, when you all roll it down, is that in 25, our benefit rate in 2024 was 51%. So nothing else happens. It probably would have been in the 52, 53% in 2026. Instead, it will go from what might have been 51, 52% down to 43.7%. That will be the rate for 2025. Again, we can support that with those one-time resources, this one-time fix in 2025. In 2026, so next year when we're doing this presentation, the rate will bounce up from 43.67 up to 49%. So two things there. Again, one, just again noting it's largely a one-time benefit, but it's not fully a one-time benefit, because again, we're 51% in this year. We might have been 53%, say, in 26. Instead, now we'll be starting at 49. So it's a modest benefit also in the out years. Each 1% is about $2.5 million. So starting off 26 at 49% instead of 52% means a $7.5 million benefit to the campuses. So it's not as big as the benefit, maybe, but it's certainly better, and some of it moves over into 26. So I'm going to stop there. I'm gonna ask Miriam if she'll clean up any mess I made, and then we'll take any questions that you might have.
I think we'll just go with the questions.
I think we're all relieved that this is not a course that we're going to be asked to take an exam on. Ryan, let me start off with one. Does that mean that in the 26 budget, we're going to have to budget for X million dollars more because of these changes? Without it, things being equal?
Yes and no. I mean, the campuses know it, so it's the same as, as if we budget for anything that's one time. If budgeting for attrition, budgeting, if the legislature just said, hey, here's $10 million on a one-time basis. So yes, it will have to be rebuilt back into the budget, but it's something that everyone has known since, pre-day one. We told them about it well in advance.
Other questions? One thing you said that I didn't quite understand, that you said that we've over collected some federal money. We don't have to pay that back to them. It just gets smoothed out over a number of years. How does that work?
I think smooth out is exactly the right word. You accumulate ups and downs, and rather than just exchanging dollars back and forth, you adjust the rate accordingly so that over a window the feds are made whole. I think that's what they care about most, rather than whether Tuesday balances with Wednesday and so on.
Thank you, Clyde Mitchell. Good morning, Clyde.
Good morning. So Vice Chancellor, I was just wanting to know, are we using up those kind of surplus reserves so they go back down to zero again? And would that mean that if we needed to do like retrenchments, we wouldn't have a pool to offset those against?
Yeah, so these dollars, the dollars we're talking about here, are specific to either federal dollars that we've over recovered, or we're talking about the benefit pool. Those two buckets can only be used in this kind of healthcare space. Separate from this, and coming up on tab 5, I'm going to talk about the budget stabilization fund, the operating reserve, which are two different reserves which fall more into the kind of the categories of use that you're talking about.
Ryan, if I could just add, I think it's safe to say, though, that because of our tie-in now with the federal rate and the ebb and flow that takes with under and over recoveries each year, we would not be in a place where we can build up a large reserve for the benefit purposes, because those rates in out years are going to be adjusted upward or downward depending on our experience over the last couple of years. So we wouldn't be in a situation where we'd end up with a $50 or $60 million benefit reserve, just to clarify.
Thank you, Miriam. Valerie?
Yeah, probably not. Thank you, Roger. I'm probably not going to form this question very well, and maybe it's for a future discussion. Ryan, with the 2 million, if I understand this correctly, I'm trying to find you on my screen. I've lost you, but wherever you are on the screen.
Yep.
The 2 million in the dependent waiver that gets moved to the campuses. So is this, number one, a new expense for the campuses that substantially changes their individual budgets once you sort of net out the benefit of the one rate? So, does it turn out to be equitable in the end? That's the first part of the question. Again, if this is a future discussion, that's fine with me. And second, then does that put the campuses in a situation where this benefit might not be promoted because it's an additional expense, and that depends on the demographics of the faculty on the campuses? So at some future point, perhaps getting a little more information on what the impact of that is, and is this something that's a net benefit to the campuses in the end, and will it actually affect how we promote this benefit among our faculty and others?
Yeah, good question. I'll take part of it, and I think you're right. Probably some of it's for a larger conversation. I think in general for the campuses, for the FY25 budget, without a doubt, it's a benefit. The value of the one-time reduction in the benefit rate, the drop from 51 down to 43.7, by far exceeds the value or the extra costs of the campus financial aid, which is 2.1 million system-wide. Going out in the budgets, kind of yes and no, I think. Check me on this one, Miriam. Is it going to impact their budgets? Well, absolutely it is. I mean, it's for the University of Maine. It'll be 1.4 million that's in their budget now that wasn't a year ago. But that will also come out of the benefit costs, which means they'll be charged less. Even on a going forward basis, they'll pick up some incremental benefit of that. So yes, but they've planned for it. So again, no surprise there. And the benefit, I can't remember if we gave you the specific. Like most of these, it does benefit by campus. Although this would be an example where I think the University of Maine by far leads the way in this one. I constantly talk about nearly everything we do, the University of Maine is 50% of it. In this case, the University of Maine is, probably closer to 65 or 70% of the total for the benefit waiver. So it will impact campuses differently.
And Ryan, maybe too, to add about the utilization of the waiver. This is a bargained benefit. So any employee's dependent can attend any one of our institutions. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily about a campus promoting it or not. It's totally up to the dependent to make the selection of the campus, and then of course to have to be accepted.
Good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Ryan, it reduces the benefit rate reduction overall, but yet that cost is being shifted to the campus. So, I mean, how are we going to figure out what really is the benefit rate out there? Because you're shifting the cost, so it's not 51%, now it's 43. How do you calculate that?
I think we've done it. So we've done the rate with all of this in. We know what the rate is once we pull those out. So again, we were looking to pull out in total about $2.7 million worth of costs. And so when we pull those out, we get a new rate. We've given the campuses exactly what they should budget for the campus financial aid piece. And we've put the $600,000 in the shared service budget. So I think we've accounted for both ends of the equation. We know, net in this budget cycle, those 2.7 million in costs. I forget what the full value of dropping from, I don't know if you remember, Miriam, the full value we got from dropping the rate was before we netted out the other costs, but it was substantially higher than the costs that we added back in.
Yeah, so not to complicate this, but so our total benefit cost again is not changing. If anything, the actual benefit cost is going up. So we're going to have about $152 million. That's what our costs for benefits are, whether it's in these waivers going to the campus or the things that aren't. Our benefit package is $152 million. We went ahead and we calculated the federal rate the same way that we always do. And so we said if we apply that rate and use that as our internal rate as well, and we have to move these things around because they're not part of the federal rate anyways, then we're going to use that federal rate, but we've still got a $152 million benefit budget that we have to cover. And that's where, when Ryan mentioned this one time taking the 10 million roughly out of reserves, that is what covers that. And then going forward, we're on the same rate. We don't have this difference between us and the feds anymore. So it's really the utilization of that over recovery that's built up over time internally that we're using to mitigate this shift. But again, as Ryan mentioned, there's not a benefit cost anywhere in this budget that's actually going down.
And I think even out into 26, if I could just note that we've talked about it being one time, but if the rate in 26 is 49%, for instance, instead of the 52 or 53 that it might have been if we would not have done this. You know, that is about a $7.5 million benefit to the campuses. So for a campus like Orono, that's about a $3.5 million benefit. That's 2.5 times more than the $1.4 million cost of picking up the scholarship. So it's a one-ish times benefit here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Any other questions before we move on? We are running a bit behind, but we have left, I think it's 40 minutes at the end for committee questions and then a further executive session. So I think a lot of these questions are getting asked now, so we're probably in good shape. Let's move on to tab 4, the tuition financial aid discussion. And our speaker continues to be Vice Chancellor Lowe.
Okay, excellent. Well, this one, again, I'd encourage any of my presidents or CBOs and Vice President from the University of Maine, who was kind enough to join us as well. I'll talk about this at a high level, and then to the extent we wanted to get into details, I'll certainly rely on the supporting cast here. Lots of questions about this one, which I completely understand. So typically, you know, in a super clean spreadsheet, you know, you might see, you know, tuition. Here's how much we think we're going to bring in tuition waivers or tuition revenue. Here's some waivers, and then here's the net amount, and you'd be able to know tuition's going up by this. Here's what's happening with discounting, and I can see the net result on a student, for instance. That is really, really complicated in this budget for a number of reasons. There are at least a half a dozen moving parts that are making those numbers kind of go up and down. You know, on the tuition side, it's not just the tuition what is the tuition increase generating, but what is happening for enrollment? Are you charging more people a 3% increase? Are you charging fewer people? And so we have enrollment changes going on as well, but specifically, and this is especially when you get down on the scholarship and waiver side of things, we've got these individual dependent tuition waivers that we were just talking about. So that hits this line. We have a number of campuses, and this is especially true at the University of Maine and the University of Southern Maine, that you recall as part of their 2024 budget. So again, the current year that we're in, one of the savings initiatives that they had, those two campuses had, was, you know, we're going to leverage these external scholarship dollars to a greater extent than we have in the past, and therefore that's going to reduce our E&G budget because we've built up this balance that we haven't distributed. So those two campuses did that in 24. It lowered the E&G amount, and so when you look at the 25 budget, well, those one-time savings weren't there. So part of the increase that you see in the discount and waiver line is just those two campuses going back up to what their base was in 2024. So that's one side of the equation. You've also got campuses that you know, needed to make budget reductions, campuses that felt like they were spending too much on financial aid. They've got a declining number of students, and so it made sense to roll back what that number is. And so it's a different story on all of our campuses. And when you throw them all into the mix, it makes it really difficult to understand, you know, what's the net impact on our students. How are we sure that we're not costing students out of the marketplace and going to negatively impact enrollment by increasing tuition, for instance? And so there are really kind of two. Again, all of that's not obvious from the campus data, or from the system data. So we've asked campuses to be prepared to talk about that as well. What I'll note that you'll see, what we're seeing at the campus level is really kind of two different stories depending on the size of your institution. And so for the University of Maine, and I'm going to rely on the experts if you want to go one layer deeper than this, but for the University of Maine, for the University of Southern Maine, they have sophisticated models where they go out and they suggest that, this is the type of class that we're looking to attract. This is what we're thinking about doing with tuition. Our tuition increase. Here's what our financial aid budget looks like. Where is the sweet spot? And so for UMaine, for USM, and I think maybe even for a little bit for the law school, they've done those kind of sophisticated calculations and understand exactly what the impact of a 3% tuition increase is going to be, and feel comfortable that we can do that without negatively impacting the bottom line. The other story that you see in some of our other campuses, and I recognize there may be one or two campuses that don't fit this perfectly, but what I'm consistently seeing on the other side is some of our smaller campuses where we're recognizing new increased tuition revenue, but the amount of tuition and waivers is flat. And that is driven, and this is especially true at Fort Kent, at Presque Isle. Those are places where the overwhelming majority of people that are paying that new tuition increase are people who are enrolled in online programs, RN to BSN. They're in the Your Pace program. They're in programs where we don't discount at anywhere near the rate that we would discount for a traditional student sitting on a campus, living in a dorm. So at the end of the day, when those campuses did their analysis, they didn't see the need to increase the aid that would go to a traditional on-campus student. We didn't need to push as much financial aid. So those are kind of the two versions of what's going on in this budget with tuition and financial aid. I wanted to defer to Kevin, if I could, just for a second, see if he wanted to offer anything, either specifically about what the University of Maine is doing or what he's seeing nationally, and then any presidents or CBOs that want to add something that I missed, and then open it up for questions. So I don't know if the vice president's on, but I'd certainly invite him to jump in if he has any comments.
Normally, I shy away from talking with trustees, so inviting me to throw in some comments, I've got about 50 tables in front of me, but the response that I would give you right now would be a qualitative response as opposed to a quantitative one, although we can get into the quantitative data as soon as you wish. We're competing in a world where you can measure our competitive level within our marketplace by looking at our acceptance rate as one measure. And by having such our acceptance rate implies that we're competing in a battlefield where there are plenty of institutions. And those institutions are also have a need to increase enrollment. So you're seeing upward pressure on discount rates based on a lot of different factors, such as our competitive space, our demographics within the state, things of this nature. So to estimate the discount rate that we would need to achieve a goal, we look at many different sources. For instance, we have an external partner, the Carnegie consultants, help us with a very sophisticated logistic model to predict the amount of cost that we must remediate to get a student to increase their likelihood of enrolling by like 1.5%, 2%. Now they focus on a sample space that would be about 80% of our first year class. Then we have to go and say, okay, what do we need to estimate as far as gift aid necessary to increase the rest of the population to a likelihood of enrolling that we find acceptable? And this is what's driving our discount rate and what makes estimating that net gain from a 3% increase in tuition a little bit difficult to make simple or to make cut and dry. Those would be my opening comments. I'm told that I get into the weeds too quickly and that I can be very complicated. So I'm trying to avoid both of those things as well as I can.
Let me see if there are any campuses that wanted to add any particular campus flair onto that, and if not, we'll go back to the chair.
Any of our presidents want to weigh in here? I'm not seeing any hands. Another second. I'm not seeing, so go ahead, why don't you go ahead, Ryan. Kevin, thank you very much for that 50,000-foot view there.
Excellent. So if there are no other questions on that, then I'd shift over to the reserve policy, if you're ready for that one, Mr. Chair.
We are. And again,
Okay,
just,
excellent.
just to lay the groundwork for this, we're going to talk about these various buckets of reserves that we have at a high level today. People can certainly ask questions, but this is an introduction to this subject, because I'm sure that on FFT, we're going to be spending a lot more time talking about particularly the two largest of those reserves and how we might be able to use them strategically as we plan for a sustainable future here. So we'll start with this process today. Pat or Trish, do you have comments to make in advance of beginning this? Pat, I think yours was first.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My question, I asked it once before, and I think I didn't ask the question very clearly, so I just wanted to ask this question. I know, Ryan, that you and Kevin explained that there are sophisticated models for University of Maine, University of Southern Maine, to kind of look at, you're finding the sweet spot. And I know that's way over my head, but I understand what you're trying to accomplish there. My only question is there any, first of all, I don't know if the sophisticated models, I assume that they're coming from some kind of consulting company. We buy a model, or we get a model from company A to do University of Maine's search for sweet spot, and we do maybe a company B to look at the University of Southern Maine to do the same kind of search for the sweet spot in our waivers and our tuition scholarships and so forth. Is there any, first of all, are we using the same company for both University of Maine and University of Southern Maine? And secondly, if not, is there any value in cost savings if we say maybe we should bid this out to see if we can get a one company to do a less expensive job of doing these sophisticated models at each campus? Is that question clear enough, Ryan?
I know what you're asking, but I'm hopefully Kevin or someone's gonna jump on from the campus. That's not a tool that we've typically used. It's one I've been fascinated by as USM and UMaine have talked about it in the last couple of years, but I don't know if one of them wants to take the lead on answering that one.
So can I take a crack at it if you don't mind?
Please.
So these companies, what they do is they have access to data set, pre-enrollment data about our students. And from that, they extract factors that are predictive of enrollment. Here at University of Maine, there are about 12 variables that we focus on. Things like, did we admit a student to their first choice major? Are they in-state versus out-of-state? Is there a specific age? The cost of attendance, all that kind of thing. If you were to go to USM and get an external consultant, chances are that the overlap in predictive variables would be about 80%. So picking a consultant would be, yes, we could probably negotiate with a consultant to get a lower price. However, the problem is, and this is because I'm going to throw the I'm still new flag out here. I joined us in June. I come from a place where we work with a different type of external consultant, focusing on some of the same external variables. They used some more machine learning than what was necessary for us. Ours was a relatively simple logistic model, but they provide results that we can consume. If I was to bring in, let's say, a Ruffalo Noel Levitz tomorrow to University of Maine, perhaps there would be a slight improvement in cost and a slight improvement in the value of the model. We wouldn't be able to consume the results very easily, so their added value to our efforts would be negative. At USM, yes, we could negotiate with Carnegie to provide services for all campuses. But could they provide the results in a way that was consumable to the culture at that campus? That would be an empirical thing that we would need to go find out. And I would be hard pressed to estimate. Perhaps Ryan would be in a better position to answer that than I. But the types of variables that they look at would be very, very similar. So the same services we could probably get for slightly less money. how is that, Ryan? Did that?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think if there's, I think what I'd recommend is maybe working with, maybe I'll work with Vice Chancellor St. John here. I think that's closer to his area. Maybe work with the campuses, have a conversation with the president, see if this is an area where there's an interest in exploring a system-wide solution. And if there is, then so be it. And if it makes sense that there are individual ones, then we'll at least have had the conversation and know that. So we can do some follow-up here if there's some interest.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Pat, for raising the question. And why don't you report back to us at some point on how those discussions went?
And I just wanted to say, I'm not questioning either campus. I'm just questioning the idea that where I come from, sometimes you try to consolidate to save money. So that's I'm being just a simple-minded guy asking a basic question. I don't question at all the complexity of the issue, and I don't want to get in the way of that at all.
Yep, totally understand what you're asking. Good question.
Thanks, Pat. Trish.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I really appreciate this, and I know how complex this issue is. I think, not for now given time, but I think what the board was looking for is a big picture. We know we're raising tuition. The budget includes tuition increases, differential tuition increases, fee increases. So I think the question is our collective student aid growing at a rate equal to that? Do we have more Pell, more discounting, and just sort of get an apples and oranges to answer the question of, as we raise the costs on students, how much are we offsetting in increases in financial aid? And I don't want to take up time now, but I think that's the fundamental question.
Yeah, and we talked about that as a group when we reached out to the individual campuses. We've got responses back from campuses that have emergency funds that try to identify, those gaps. And so you're in a particular program and we've done everything we can and you're still coming up a little bit short. Well, here's this fund. So we got lots of examples like that. We know Pell is up. We know the Maine State Grant Program is up. It's just challenging seeing them in our numbers. It's more the individual Kevin stories that talk about how they leverage those at the campus level.
Yep. I have a table that I'm told is way too complicated and messy for anyone to consume. But what it does is it looks at the carrying cost of our E&G financial aid and what it's going to take to bring in the new class. And no matter what we use as an estimate based on all of these complex models, it's a messy estimate. There's some error around each one of those. And we embed that error in our modeling. It would not be terribly useful not to say, this is going to be within a range, or we would always be over budget or under budget and underperforming. So by embedding that range, I believe at UMaine, we're pushing the upper limit of that range, but the 3% increase we would likely be able to manage with the budget plan that we have right now. As Ryan highlighted, there are always going to be those students that encounter unexpected levels of need or unanticipated circumstances where we have a reserve fund to try to assist them. But in our base model, I think we've addressed a lot of different scenarios.
Thanks very much. I see Kelly has her hand up. Kelly?
Yeah, I might just, I work with Kevin a lot, so I'm going to put it in Kelly's terms. He's smarter than I am, so I like to simplify it for myself, and we spent a lot of time talking about this yesterday. Simply said, our tuition and fees are increasing. The revenues associated with that, I think we're down about 4,000 student credit hours for next year, or 2% reduction in our student credit hours are anticipated. We built the 3% and the differential changes into the model or the logistical model that Kevin has been referring to for our campus at the time that we built or planned for the financial aid allocation. And as Vice Chancellor Lowe said, we had some one-times. We had $3.8 million in one-time offsets for financial aid for FY24 that we don't have to apply for FY25. So if I add those back to our base, we have an $800,000 increase between FY24 and FY25 in actual dollars across all fund types. So for a $6 million increase in tuition, we're spending $800,000 more in financial aid. So, and we've made sure that those students who are in most need are Pell eligible or are Inspire Main students. We've made sure that those students will continue to receive their full cost of tuition and fees in their grants. So in the planning that we've done, we are seeing the benefit from a financial perspective of those tuition and fee increases, and we're not paying them all out in financial aid. And I'm happy to provide more detail if it's helpful.
Thank you, Kelly. Can someone just remind us how much Pell went up this year and how much the Main State grant went up this year? Does anybody know off the top of their head?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know the impact of the FAFSA simplification. It is a messy implementation, to be sure, but I know that it's going to increase the total number of Pell eligible students from us by about 6%, which is around 130 new students who would not have gotten Pell will get Pell this year, taking the total anticipated Pell headcount up to around 2,200 when it was historically like 2060 or something like that. Now, it's also because of the way it's more complicated and how they estimate the amount of a Pell award, but we anticipate the total number of full Pell eligible students to go up and our Inspire expenditure to go up as well. But the Main State grant, I don't have off the top of my head. I apologize.
That's okay.
I will find out and I will get back with you to be sure.
So well, thank you. That would be helpful. I think we've heard it before. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, I think it went up a couple of years ago, maybe not this year, but we can get those numbers.
Okay, good. Any other questions on this before we move on to our reserve policies? So again, I'm sorry.
It just looks like it's gone up to 20. It's at 2,500.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Good. All right. Again, the beginning of the discussion of our reserve policies. So this is more of a short educational session for us. Certainly an opportunity to ask questions, but we'll be revisiting this in terms of any changes we want to make to the rules of the game, so to speak, with of any of these accounts. So Ryan, why don't you kick that off if you would? Okay.
So my plan was to talk a little bit about the existing reserve policy. I know you've all been waiting for that discussion. I'll talk a little bit about the current administrative practice letters on that. I'll talk to you about the balance that we have in some of these accounts, and then maybe can reference the drafts for discussion only kind of policy changes that you have and what those might do. So let me start with just a little bit of background. Here we go. So this is the current administrative practice letter on reserves. The yellow piece is just my own highlighting for things that I was going to cover. So again, lots of details in here. I would encourage a read when you get a chance. 9 pages of excitement around reserves and other categories of unrestricted net position. And so as you would expect, the administrative practice letter, which is probably in need of an update. We updated this in 2017. This is the time that we were doing the unified budget and the allocation model, and that was the appropriate time to reserve this or to amend this. We haven't been back since. So this APL lays out the major categories of net position. It provides detailed description of those, as well as some subcategories of unrestricted net position. It also identifies target levels. So, you know, what is an ideal amount to have in our budget stabilization fund, to have in our operating reserve? Includes some definitions. I think one of the pieces I would really emphasize on the front end is, this is really true for a lot of our APLs. This applies at both the system and the campus level. So when we start talking about reserves and categories of reserves, they're generally rules, policies, definitions that apply not only to the system's definitions of, you know, what this unrestricted net, you know, account, unrestricted net position, what this particular account might be. It doesn't only apply to just the system, but also to the campuses. So we have a definition in here of reserves. So again, we're talking about, you know, accumulated surpluses and deficits generated over a number of years. We've got a purpose in here. So protecting UMS and the campuses in case of unexpected shortfalls in revenue. So again, it might be a shortfall in enrollment, it might be a curtailment, to cover any kind of unanticipated expenses, legal fees, disasters, utility costs, and then what we've talked about for a while, provide an opportunity for strategic one-time investments. So again, as I noted, really kind of a fork in the road when you get to reserves. There's some campus operating reserves, which typically, when we look at campus reserves, fall under E&G operating reserves and auxiliary reserves. Those are really kind of the two buckets that you would think about as a campus when we come and we talk to you and we present budgets, and if they have budget transfers, those are the two buckets that they would come from a campus. I'll note back in 2017 when we were doing this, we did come up with a target. So the goal was that these reserve accounts, to the extent they were at a campus or a system, would be equivalent of 10% of operating expenses. So for a system like ours, that might be 60 to 65 million in a reserve account. 18%, like the state budget stabilization cap, was kind of ultimately what our goal was. But we set an interim target of 10% as well. As of, I think, the budget presentations that we did, the only campus that is at this 18% range was University of Maine at Augusta. So where I really wanted to focus the conversation today is down here in part 2, which is what we refer to as central reserves. So reserves held by the system. There are 4 categories that I'll briefly touch on right here, and then again I'll narrow it down. But under those 4 kind of pools that you would see at the system, you have the benefit pool carryover. So again, that's the one we were talking about in the context of the benefit rate reduction. As noted here in the bottom, the ideal balance of this is 3 to 6 months worth of expected paid health claims and expenses. We are right at 3 months, right on the low end of that, although we're in the band. I think we have roughly $100 million a year. And so that 25 million, 26 million that we have falls into the 3 category there. Budget stabilization fund. So again, talk about the budget stabilization fund, really meant to weather those financial impacts of adverse investment markets, state of Maine economic conditions, other financial challenges. Funding from this one, as you know, comes from net investment income related to UMS's operating investments. So this is what we really think of in the true sense as a rainy day fund. It has had a balance as high as about 21 million 2 or 3 years ago. It is down to 4.5 million right now. The balance has been eroded by a couple of factors. One is some transfers that we have made out to campuses. And then the other one, and the biggest impact, is the adverse investment markets. You'll recall a couple of years ago, we lost roughly $16 million for the fiscal year, and that's really what took us from that high water mark of 21 down to roughly the 4.5 million that we have right now. The goal of that one, again, is it should be the equivalent of exactly what it is. It's your budget stabilization. It's your rainy day account. It's not your checking account. And so if somebody, at the end of this meeting comes up with the best idea possible and we're looking for a source of funds, the budget stabilization fund is not a place where we would recommend to go for that. If we had a budget emergency, if the legislature decided to curtail us tomorrow, that is a more appropriate bucket for budget stabilization fund. Next one, and I'll briefly just cover, is the risk management reserve. So again, just really designated to assist the campuses in paying deductibles when we have large claims. I'm not going to talk about that one, so I'll skip down to the next one. And then unified operating reserve, so more of the working capital E&G operating reserve we refer to as this. So this one is really consistent with some of the language that the trustees have been using about, help us identify a source of funding that can be used for strategic investments. That is what this bucket is. This is more of the, we've got a really good idea. We can't wait until the next round of budget discussions. What are our options? And so we'll look at the operating reserve as well. Again, we had a 10% target for the operating reserve at the system level. So those are the buckets at the system level. As far as balances, let me just touch on the three accounts that I referenced today. The benefit pool has a balance just over $26 million. I've referenced that a couple of times, and not really subject to any of the potential changes that are outlined in at least in your discussion only reserve policy draft. The two big ones for us are the E&G operating reserve and the budget stabilization fund. Budget stabilization fund currently has a balance of 4.5 million. The E&G reserve has a balance of 15.8 million. That one, again, as a reminder, tends to cover just looking back, what are the type of things that we have funded from that account. Investments that the board was making, renovation costs at 300 4th Street, so Main Law. When we originally moved into that building, it was not in the condition that it is today. The trustees, the FFT committee agreed that we wanted to make investments. We could have taken that from budget stabilization fund. At that time, we had a good investment year, and so we grabbed some funds, moved some funds over to operating, and then dedicated those funds as well. Other examples. So again, recall earlier this year, and I won't go into details about either one of these, given we're in public session, but we've had lawsuits where the board has made the decision that it's in our best interest with counsel to settle. That is the type of place where we would go, the operating reserve, where we would go to fund something like that. We have had retrenchments in the past where there is a large one-time impact from those decisions, and trustees have made the decisions on a couple of occasions with the recommendation of board of the chancellor to cover that cost centrally, to cover that from the system, and that is something where we might use the E&G reserve, the operating reserve from as well. So before I get into the changes, I think I'll pause there, pause right there, Mr. Chair, and see if there are any questions about the two reserve accounts in particular, and then I'll jump into the questions or to the policy change after that, if you'd like.
Thanks, Ryan. Let me lead off with a couple of quick ones. I understand that the budget stabilization fund is at 4.5 million, and you only value, if I understand correctly, you value that once a year, so the next valuation won't come until July 1.
Yep. So end of June 30th, we'll do another snapshot, the same report I regularly give the board. So I think when I gave you a report recently, we're running about $10 million ahead. So we'll pretend for a minute. I always say I don't like jinxing it, but pretend for a minute we finished the year and we're still at 10 million, or cross our fingers, we're even in a better position. Over the course of the several weeks between June 30th and when we would close out the books, we work with Miriam and her team, work with Tracy Elliott and Darla, work with the chancellor and then come back to you, to FFT, to the board chair, to the trustees, to essentially make a recommendation. You know, we ended the year $15 million ahead. We would recommend, you know, 7 million go into budget stabilization, 3 million go into operating reserve, and then 3 million be used to close the gap that we identified in repaving Main Street, for instance.
Right.
So those are the kind of that's the kind of recommendation that would will come to you after we close the fiscal year.
And the only other question is something came out of our conversation, but it's not appropriate to take significant amounts of money out of the budget stabilization fund to fund special projects, as opposed to from the system operating reserve because of the rating agency's oversight of that. Is that true? Could you explain?
Yeah, I mean, the rating agencies want to know you have a budget stabilization fund. What have you set aside for the budget emergency that happens? And we've had them happen before in the form of curtailments, for instance. And so we want to be able to point to a fund that we have that is there for that specific purpose, not also a fund where we took $50,000 out of it yesterday because we want to do something really cool, or we need more marketing money. So that's why we kind of, you know, in my simple checking account, savings account kind of analogy, we want that one to be preserved. And so if we end the year with $10 million extra, and the committee says, hey, we want to invest all 10 million of that, we don't think any should go in the budget stabilization fund, we would capture that money before it gets to the budget stabilization fund and fund those priorities that you have. We wouldn't want it to go into the fund and then pull it back out for the idea of the day, for instance.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Questions? Not seeing any. So you want, I'm sorry, Trish, pardon me.
Thank you. That was a great review. And I know we've talked about this a lot, sort of offline, Ryan. So on the issue of the budget stabilization, I think we just have to be careful in our discussions as we've evolved. We clearly need the capacity to make clear that we are committed to all our universities, to all our campuses, need to sustain them. I'm a little concerned about the term expense reductions, because I think what this board wants to do is make certain that we do everything we can to maximize unified accreditation, to think about efficiencies, to think about new ways of doing business. So maybe some revision on that language, so that we're very clear about our commitment to budget stabilization to all our universities. But the way to get there isn't, you know, I think we're going to be consistent about our commitment to not use budget stabilization, except in certain circumstances.
Yep. And the next piece of this is really meant to tackle what are those certain circumstances. So if you're ready, Mr. Chair, I'll jump over to the document. I didn't think enough ahead of time, and now I've got so many screens open and papers in front of me, I'm not sure I can bring it up, but everyone has a copy in today's board materials of the reserve policy potential changes. And so I want to be super clear. Worked extensively with the chancellor on this in the fall, and the goal was to be responsive to some of the feedback that we were hearing from trustees about reserves. And so tried to draft it in that light. I don't want to pretend that it's, this is the chancellor's policy, this is exactly what he would do, or even that it's the board's policy, because when I drafted it, I really, really tried to go to one extreme. So, you don't want to use, we don't want the budget stabilization fund to be a regular withdrawal from campuses. Clearly got that message. So the draft here probably takes it too far. To the point the chair made, there's a sweet spot there, and I'm not sure this is it, but let me walk through and at least tell you what you have in front of you and kind of start that discussion. So we've walked through the current state of reserve policies and so on. Again, as I note in the document, I kind of lay out what the status of those current funds are. And then near the bottom of that page, there is some potential for some, I use the term recommended. I don't know if that's the right word, but really just discussion starters. One of those, again, I mentioned early on, the policy, the reserve policy itself hasn't been redrafted since July of 2017. So I think it might make sense for us to go in, look at all of that language, and really just refreshen it, make sure that it makes sense, make sure it's consistent with what the board's intent is. And then specific to the budget stabilization fund, the potential of recommending that, I will admit right now, the language around the budget stabilization fund in existing policy is pretty wide open. It's any kind of, it's not just an economic condition, it's the state of Maine. It's really, we've got a budget problem and so we'd like access to additional resources. So did try to look at the potential for tightening up that language. And so what we put in here as a starting point was that budget stabilization fund support will go to campuses only when necessary. Expense reductions, again, maybe not the perfect word, would compromise campus viability. It would require the approval of both the finance committee and the full board of trustees during the annual budget process. So to that last piece, that's a little bit redundant because we require that right now. It's part of the proposal that you have in front of you, is some budget stabilization funds, but it would solidify in policy that can only happen with FFT and full board approval. The question of whether the right trigger is campus viability, I think that is one that's open for discussion. I feel like that's probably too far, but it's maybe not. Maybe it's closer to, if we're here now and campus viability is over here, I think we probably need to get closer to campus viability than we are now, but maybe not all the way to that level, that extreme level. The second piece of this potential policy, again, defines the operating reserve a little bit more clearly, makes it very clear that the fund is available for strategic investments that promote system-wide growth, stimulate reform, or expand program benefiting the system as a whole. So the language that's there now, probably you could argue accomplishes some of this. It's there for strategic purposes. I think this, again, really attempts to clarify the language to make it a little bit more consistent with what the board is talking about, not just strategic investments, but here's the type of strategic investments that we're looking at. So those are kind of really the two areas we honed in on: the budget stabilization fund, the operating reserves, trying to make them more consistent, clarifying which one of those funds is available for the strategic investments that the board is recommending, and maybe which one would not be a great use of that. But I think I'll stop right there. I don't know if the chancellor has anything that he'd like to add. Again, we worked on this quite a while back a couple of months ago, but then I'll open it back up, Mr. Chair, if there are any questions.
Again, I think what Ryan and I were trying to do was to give you a draft and a series of recommendations that we thought would be protective of our financial condition, but not exclude the possibility of assistance when required. And likewise, also identify a funding source for strategic initiatives, or monies for strategic initiatives. So it may not be perfect, but it is an attempt to address the charge that was given by the trustees. And I think it's a good start. Clearly we're open to hearing other comments and reacting to them, either instantly or over a period of time. But this was a major effort.
Thanks, Chancellor. Ryan, could you just go back in terms of timing? So let's say that again,
Roger, can I ask a question?
Please, I'm sorry, Emily, I didn't see your hand.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I will say Ryan, you called this out, but I'm gonna agree with you that I don't love the word viability. I'm wondering if maybe we should look at words like campus competitiveness or effectiveness. Viability seems to me sort of a live or die assessment, and I think what we're trying to do is is prevent harm, right? And make sure we're using it for strategic opportunity. So I would just provide that feedback. You seemed hesitant about the word viability. I wanted to +1 your hesitancy. Maybe we could think about different, less sort of live or die language.
Well, stability is really what what.
Yes, and that's
probably
a great word. And that might be the word too. I think that's why viability just doesn't seem to capture what we're going for when it comes to campuses. We're I think sustainability, so you know, those words definitely would be better.
Thanks. Thank you, Emily. Ryan, so we get to the end of the fiscal year and it's consistent with today. So there's $10 million there of additional investment income. Could you just take us through the process of how in the past we have dealt with that decision making about what to do?
Yep. So it's I'll admit it's been largely informal. That's the process that I inherited when I came in, I think in 2016 into this position. But typically, you know, we'll get to the end of the year. And so as we mentioned, we'll know, you know, by the end of July, what investment income looks like sometime in that same kind of time window. Like several of you are familiar with in state government, we'll do all the year-end calculations and we'll know whether, last month I forecasted, I think that governance was going to be $500,000 ahead, for instance. So if governance ends $500,000 a year ahead, then, you know, that goes in the bucket as well. So we're going to do this process where we're going to figure out where we stand at year end. And then I'll work with Miriam and then the chancellor, and we'll expand the group as we go out to the trustees with essentially just a recommendation on how we would allocate those out. And so what would we recommend going into the budget stabilization fund? What would we recommend going into the operating reserve? And then, you know, maybe there's a one-off. Well, we really only need to put it into those two accounts. In theory, we could take some money off if you said, but we also want you to fund this particular initiative, you know, that could be the third bucket. But we can also just put it into operating reserves and then pull it out of operating reserves. It doesn't have the same budget stabilization fund restrictions. So I'd imagine by sometime end of August or so, we're coming back to you with a recommendation on how we allocate out, if we're fortunate enough to have any surplus funds at the end of the year. We again do that by August. We could figure out whether that needs to be a formal process that would go to FFT, and then the board can work with maybe with Paul on that. But certainly unofficially, that feels like the right timeline.
That's great. I just couldn't remember if it formally came to our committee last year, and if then there was a formal board.
It doesn't. It ends up being conversations with the board chair and the FFT chair, and then we roll them into FFT conversations where we say, hey, you know, here's how the year ended. But it has not been like an agenda item. It's, as I understood it, it was always the exercise under the authority that the treasurer has at the end of the year to allocate funds consistent with trustees and so on. So that's the way it's always been handled. But again, happy to work with Paul and make sure that still makes sense and see if we need to formalize that in a different way and work with you and the chair on that.
Thank you very much. Owen.
Chancellor, did you have a comment on that topic before?
I'm sorry, Chancellor, I didn't see you. Pardon me.
Well, Owen's more important than me, but what I would say is that a good example of how we've spent this money is we can take it from what we did last year and for the current year. As you know, our strategic plan calls for us to enlarge our population, particularly amongst non-traditional students, and particularly to attract students who may have started a collegiate program and never finished. So what did we do? We went to each of the campuses and said, we're prepared to make a grant to you if you give us a plan on how you're going to go after this particular audience of people. Then you get responses, you negotiate those responses, and then ultimately come to an agreement And quite frankly, I can't imagine that we would do anything that is not that we would ever recommend anything that's not supportive of making sure we have the audience of students that we need for stability purposes, and quite frankly, to go after new groups that we may not have concentrated sufficiently on in the past.
Thanks, Chancellor. I assume that money came out of the system operating reserve. Is just procedurally, is that what happened? Or Ryan, if you know? I'm sorry, you're on mute, Ryan.
I think those ones specifically were adult degree completion or early college dollars that we got from the state. And they come in for a dedicated purpose, and then they kind of end up in a reserve because they just kind of roll if you don't spend it all in 1 year.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Owen.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. On the budget stabilization, I like the concept of stability versus viability. I do think, as I think about it, it's stability for the moment with the idea of like, what's the long-term plan to change, I think is what, in my mind, what's going through. So we don't get stuck where we just spend it every year, which seems like everyone might be there, but I think that's important. And on the operating reserve utilization, I had a couple of, just comments on some language here, right? Like, and maybe I might be N of one, but when I see system-wide growth, right, I read it may have to benefit everyone, but when I think about it from a strategic lens, we might have something that's going really well that we want to invest in and increase, right? So it might be growth areas, and that might be the intent, Ryan, but I just wanted to flag that. And this could also fit under there where, I think it could fit on expand program or stimulate reform, but in certain cases, we might want to run experiments that are one time or projects or like things where we want to say, hey, look, how do we use AI in a different way? Or how do we use things in a different way, that fit with our competitive advantage? And I would imagine like running experiments that could be future growth areas could be something we could consider under that. Might not be limited by this language, but I wanted to throw that in there. And then the question I had related, and Chancellor just kind of laid out a good example of this, is like, we need to set it as a board, some of these strategic areas, but do we get like, if we are clear about what we're looking for, like, is there instances where we get ideas from presidents or from chancellor or others on like where this looks like? Because you all are running everything every day. And I think like could be some good things that bubble up from everyone to drive these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to go back to your, I love the comment you made, Trustee Kane made around stability. Again, I knew that the first word wasn't the sweet spot and that it was over this way, but I think you said it super well. Is what trustees generally want it for is to bridge someone to get from here to there and not just be a constant, okay, I'll see you next year on June the 30th. And so I drafted the viability language, but then immediately told Roger that I didn't like it because it doesn't allow for that example right there. There may be times where it strategically makes sense that I don't want you to run everything down to zero first. We're going to do this infusion because you've been doing everything that you said you were going to do. And it's just a question of timing and not willpower or anything like that. So love that comment.
Thanks, Barbara.
Based on input from FFT in this discussion, I presume what you want is a change in the document that is currently published under the Board of Trustee policies. Is that a correct assumption?
I don't know that I've looked. I'd have to go back and look at the Board of Trustee piece. These are administrative practice letters generally that cover reserve policy and reserve definitions. I haven't looked to see what the board policy side of it is, but I'll make a note to double check that piece anyway.
I was going to say we have a little group looking at changes to those policies and the associated documents that are published under each of those. And I don't know the situation on these documents, by the way. I haven't looked either. But if it makes sense, Trustee Pat is a member of our little group, and I and Trustee Eames, the vice chair, take a look at these and bring them forward to the board for draft consideration, comment, and then adoption in a subsequent meeting. And I'm not sure of the process that you intended to follow here, but it might make sense to go through something like that to get a set of actual red line changes to these documents in a way that allows an official approval of them along the way.
Yeah, that's great feedback. I work with Miriam. We'll go back and look at the board policy compared to the administrative practice letters and see if there is overlap. Even if there's not overlap, though, I think your points are all still good ones about feedback and so on. So one, I'd welcome any feedback on any drafts that we do. But I know Vice Chancellor St. John's office kind of did I forget what the terminology is, but a process for administering changes to APLs, lays it out very clear. I think Jamie worked on that very clearly. And so we would use that template to make sure that we get all of the appropriate stakeholder input and so on. Again, starting first here, these would be your policies. So even if it's not in the board policy, it's in an APL, we want to make sure you have plenty of opportunity to weigh in.
Thanks, Ryan. So I think going from here, you've heard some good feedback from the board today that you can take into account in another draft of this. I'm sure there ought to be, and I'm sure there is some sort of a mechanism for the presidents to weigh on this as well, because they're certainly have thoughts on this, I'm sure. Love to hear them today if anybody wants to share them, but hopefully there'll be the opportunity for input from the university presidents as well. And then maybe we can come back with to receive from you some suggested language at, if not the next meeting, the following one.
Yep. I think you're right. I think it would probably be the following one because I like the allocation model. I always want to make sure that we, that process involves campus feedback and so absolutely.
Excellent. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add on this subject today? Any of the presidents, anybody on the screen here? Yes, Joan?
Yeah, I would just reinforce the conversation that we were having toward the end of just a minute ago about this notion of growth areas, experiments, bridge. I liked Ryan's language of bridge from here to there, with clear visions of what the there might be at a campus level or with combinations of campuses. And I think that would be a very exciting way to imagine a use of some of these funds.
Thank you. Yes, Ray Rice, President.
Thank you. I would just add to what Joan said, agree entirely with those comments. I especially like the idea to kind of incentivizing campuses, institutions to try those, try those models and strategic initiatives, because it was a relatively small amount of money that the system, through its reserves, was able to provide UMPI, because we did not have it built into our budget that led to the competency-based programming, right? So, and that's been obviously transformative for the institution and opportunity and the system itself. So, and again, that was a relatively small amount of funds made available to small institutions. So that kind of strategically particularly put into a creative, I think, in a pilot program that is focused on enrollment growth and allows an institution to take a risk that it otherwise would not be able to based upon its budget, can really be transformative for all of us.
Thanks, Ray. Other questions or comments from anybody on this subject? Not seeing any. So we're now, there are two things left on our agenda. One, a question and answer period on any subject we've touched on today. And then we'll go into executive session, which may be for a brief period of time. From the trustees or from anyone, any comments or questions, or do you want to circle back on any of these topics we've covered this morning? I'm not seeing any. So we're going to end we'll end this public session, and I'm going to entertain a motion in a minute to go in executive session. We'll do that. We'll be there for however long that takes, and then we'll be adjourning the meeting there. So could I have a motion for the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee of the Board of Trustees to go into executive session under the provision of 1 MRSA Section 4056A to discuss the evaluation of personnel and the consideration and discussion of appointments, evaluations, employment, and duties, as well as 1 MRSA Section 4056C to discuss the condition, acquisition, or disposition of real property or economic development if premature disclosure of the information would prejudice the competitive or bargaining position of the University of Maine system. I have such a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Trustee Mishu and seconded by Trustee Kane. Beth, could you take the roll call vote, please?
Yes. Trustee Cates,
Yes.
trustee Flood,
Yes?
trustee Riley,
Yes,
trustee Mishu,
Yes.
trustee McMahon,
Yes.
trustee Kane.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you. So we'll be going to executive session. Those of you who are not joining us in executive session, thank you very much for the morning. We had some terrific discussions this morning, much food for thought going forward. So thank you very much, and we'll see everybody else in executive session momentarily.